Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Benedictson. I'm pleased to have the opportunity on behalf of the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa and on behalf of my colleagues at the Centre for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability to welcome participants to this event. We are expecting something in the nature of 75 live bodies in here this morning once people deal with the cold weather and the buses and parking, and something in the order of magnitude of 200 people joining this event online from other locations. Of course, those who are arriving and participating technologically are fully welcome to the event, although they will not be in a position to download lunch. Dean Natalie DesRosiers of our Common Law section and Dean Celine Levesque of the Civil Law section send their greetings and welcome. Dean DesRosiers, who has had personal environmental law experience earlier in her career, hopes to join the gathering at some point during the day tomorrow. I think this workshop or symposium is the third time that those of us in Ottawa have had the wonderful opportunity of assisting colleagues in Calgary at the Centre for Resources Law in laying on this program supported by Environment Canada. The level of interest, I think, speaks to the importance of increasing understanding of ongoing developments in environmental law across the country. Thanks to all who have contributed by way of papers and will contribute by way of presentations and will contribute by way of important and probing questions over the course of the next couple of days to the development of a solid and impressive program. Good wishes to everyone who has signed on for 2 days of learning. A final closing note from me by way of logistics. If you would like to leave your coats in a cloakroom or to use the washroom, you'll be able to do that just by turning to the left down a hallway after you work your way out through these two sliding glass doors. For those of you who are new to this room, the important word is sliding. I've been in this room on any number of occasions where people are significantly frustrated that they can neither pull nor push. Those are indeed sliding doors. May I now turn this over to Owen Saunders, who is going to get the proceedings underway.
Thank you, Jamie. As Jamie said, my name is Owen Saunders. Good morning. And on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Resources Law and the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, I'd like to welcome you all to this symposium, both those of you who are physically present today and those of you who are joining us as virtual participants on the internet. And I suspect the latter will have increased given today's weather. Je voudrais aussi vous accueillir au nom du doyen de la faculté du droit à l'Université de Calgary, Ian Holloway, qui ne peut pas se joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from some of the leading thinkers and practitioners in environmental law in Canada, and I would like to thank them right now for taking the time to share their insights with us. Many of the speakers need no introduction to those of you who are familiar with Canadian environmental law, Therefore, I will provide no introduction, or at least no detailed summary of their qualifications, which in any event you can find in the conference materials. Again, though, my sincere thanks for their willingness to share their expertise with us. Je voudrais remercier aussi Environnement Canada, qui a fourni le financement pour ce symposium, as Jamie Benedictson has already indicated. Now, as to the question of languages for this seminar, although there will be no simultaneous translation, participants should feel free to send their questions in whatever language they choose. And of course, copies of all papers in both official languages will be posted to the symposium website. Pour ce qui est des communications pendant le symposium, bien qu'il n'y aura pas d'interprétation simultanée, les participants sont invités à envoyer leurs questions dans la langue de leur choix. Bien entendu, les articles seront disponibles sur le site Internet du symposium dans les deux langues officielles. Now, as to how to send in questions, we will try to strike a balance between our physical attendees and our web participants. For the former, the people in this room, simply write out your questions on the index cards that have been provided to you. And if your writing is anything like mine, you might prefer to print. And for webcast participants, please submit your questions for speakers, again in either French or English, to the email address you will find on the webcast homepage. And I will receive them here on my iPad or iPhone or whatever I happen to have. Je voudrais répéter pour les participants par webdiffusion que vous pouvez adresser vos questions aux conférenciers, soit en français, soit en anglais, à l'adresse électronique que vous trouverez sur la page de la webdiffusion. So, without further ado, let's move on to the people you have really come to listen to. It's not me. We're going to begin today's session with an overview of the whole question of inspections and compliance. We thought an overview could usefully be an introduction to this from a number of perspectives, and particularly an academic perspective, a federal perspective, and a provincial perspective. And we're delighted to have with us today by web, if not in person, Martin Olszynski, who is assistant professor of the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary and formerly worked in the public service. He will present the first paper by remote. Those of you who want to ask questions of Martin, we will have his email posted. The questions will not be answered today, or at least not live, but he has undertaken to answer any questions you may have by email. Secondly, we're going to hear the federal perspective from Heather McCready, who is Executive Director of Environmental Enforcement, Environment and Climate Change Canada in, as you know, Gatineau. And special thanks to Heather because she is doing double duty. We're going to ask her to present again tomorrow. And finally, the provincial perspective will be given by Jamie Flegel, who is counsel with the Ontario Minister of the Environment and Climate Change in Toronto. So we're going to begin, first of all, with a tape of the talk by Martin Olszynski on the academic perspective.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Martin Olszynski. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Calgary Faculty of Law. I want to apologize at the outset that I wasn't able to join you today in Ottawa, but a prior commitment made that very difficult to do. I recognize, of course, that I will not be able to take any questions after my presentation today, but if you do have questions and you'd like to get in touch, please do feel free to ask Sue Parsons for my email, or alternatively, you can find it on the University of Calgary Law School website. So the topic of my presentation today, somewhat controversial maybe, compliance and enforcement in Canadian environmental law, a crisis in the making. And so my basic objective today is to demonstrate to you that current approaches to compliance and enforcement in Canadian environmental law are badly inadequate, and that improvement will require a concerted and systematic effort. And so, in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to provide a bit of a historical perspective on this problem. We'll then look at some recent events, anecdotes, Lac-Mégantic and Mount Poly as two examples of this problem. But then, of course, getting into something a bit more systematic to really look at the problem more dispassionately to see whether or not those two are sort of just flukes or one-time incidents, or whether or not we do in fact have something going on at a sort of more at a deeper and systemic level. And here we're going to be looking at some information, some charts prepared by EcoJustice in 2011, their report Getting Tough on Environmental Crime, but also reports from the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development. And so there are various chapters here that we could look at. I'll spend some time talking about those relevant to Environment Canada, Transport Canada, and the NEB. And then to spend a bit of time, hopefully, talking about a path forward and how to address this problem going forward. And so on the historical side, of course, the problem of compliance and enforcement is a long-standing one. Back in 2004, so well over a decade now, in what is still considered the authoritative assessment of Canadian environmental law, Dr. David Boyd concluded that a failure to effectively implement and enforce laws was one of Canadian environmental law's fundamental defects. Okay, and so and he noted, suggesting that this problem goes back, in fact, to the 19th century and the slaughter of the buffalo, which was illegal and yet continued unabated. In 1999, the Globe and Mail describes Canada as the promised land for polluters because of a 78% drop in prosecution rates. Okay, and so in this presentation, what I'm going to suggest is that the problem has not only persisted, it has gotten much worse. And so here, we could spend some time as just an example. Again, Lac-Mégantic, right? So this is the incident wherein an employee of the MM&A railway company failed to secure a sufficient number of handbrakes on a train that was parked up sort of above Lac-Mégantic, following a separate sort of incident involving a fire wherein the train's engines had to be turned off. This caused the air brakes to deflate and allowed the train to get away from its position, and eventually rolling into Lac-Mégantic at high speeds, coming off the rails and exploding because it was carrying very flammable bacon crude. In the Transportation Safety Board report, which followed the incident, the board concluded that, or found that for several years, Transport Canada's regional office in Quebec had identified MM&A as a company that required more frequent inspections, but that TC's regional office in Quebec did not always follow up to ensure that these recurring problems were analyzed, nor that the underlying conditions were fixed. Similarly, MM&A had developed a safety management system in 2002, but TC's regional office did not audit it until 2010, despite clear indications that the company's safety management system was not effective. Similarly, TC's headquarters in Ottawa did not effectively monitor the region's activities to know what was going on. Moving across the country over to British Columbia, we have the Mount Poly spill in sort of in the central BC. So this is Imperial Mines, metal mine here, where following perhaps additional rain, one of the dams breaks and tailings water and tailings find themselves are released in massive quantities into the Fraser River system. In assessing the root causes of the dam break, BC's Chief Inspector of Mines notes in his report that the incident was made possible by site investigations that were not conducted with sufficient detail, requests by the regulator for information or clarification that were discounted, inadequate site supervision and risk identification, and so on. Of course, it would be inappropriate to draw sweeping conclusions about enforcement, compliance and enforcement in Canada on the basis of these two examples, so we need to look at more systematic assessments. So in 2011, EcoJustice released a report, Getting Tough on Environmental Crime, wherein it made the following findings, and we're going to discuss some of these in more detail. Generally, they found that there's been a consistent decline in environmental enforcement activities, including warnings and orders, since about 2005, 2006. Average fines under CEPA 99, Canada's flagship environmental legislation, stood at around $10,500 per conviction in the last 3 years sampled. So this, of course, raises some serious doubts about their deterrent effect. And finally, and importantly, as we go through some of the figures that we're about to go through, they noted that enforcement data under different federal environmental laws is often gathered using inconsistent methods and methodologies. So, in addition to sort of as a general something to think about in terms of improvement, as we're going through the numbers that we're about to go through, please do keep that in mind, that if they're not perfect, in part that's because they're not available. So with respect to CEPA 99, here we have almost 10 years of data, and what we see, some oscillation, variation in the number of investigations. This is the light blue color going up and down. The darker blue is the number of prosecutions, and the red is the number of convictions. And so, of course, you see that seldom has there been more than 20 prosecutions in any given year. Usually it seems to hover around anywhere between 4 and 12 or 13. And the number of convictions, roughly approximating half of that number. With respect to the Fisheries Act, a slightly different picture emerges. Here it's very clear that up until about 2004 and 2005, we actually had some considerable enforcement activity, at least in the context of warnings being issued. We also had roughly 50 to 70 charges being laid, and prosecutions in the around 30, all of which declines, warnings most sharply, around 2004 and 2005. And this coincides with DFO's adoption of a risk-based approach, which we'll spend some time talking about at the end of the presentation. But in any event, then we see a very significant decline in the number of warnings, and similarly less significant because they were never as high, but similarly a decline in charges and convictions, the blue and the green lines. I've done some of my own research on the implementation of the Fisheries Act recently, and was able to carry that trend past 2008-9 and right up until 2013, 2014. And we see essentially, you'll see again on the left there, that massive decrease in 2004 and 5, the purple line, that's the number of warnings issued. And so that essentially did plateau, a bit of an increase maybe in 2009-10, but then right back to that sort of number around 50. Charges similarly, a bit of an increase there around 2008-9, but generally speaking have flatlined. A newer figure here on the right side, this light blue line that only that has essentially 3 points and then drops very significantly. This is hours allocated to enforcement, and so this was some information we were able to glean from some of DFO's annual reports to Parliament. And so what you see here is that even under this sort of truncated enforcement regime where we only have 50 or so warnings being issued, there was roughly 35,000 hours allocated to enforcement in that period. And then following 2012, this is the introduction of Bills C-38 and 45 and the associated budget cuts to DFO, we see a massive drop, over 70% to 10,000 hours allocated to enforcement. So whatever problems that we had, clearly here we're seeing less resources being dedicated to the task, which seldom results in increased or improved performance. With respect to the Fisheries Species at Risk Act, again, the numbers are a bit weird and certainly they're limited. We see a spike in the number of inspections up to about 150 in 2008, but then dropping right back down to 60. We've had one conviction in 2008 and one in 2009. So obviously these numbers need to be updated, but they don't tell a good story. With respect to the Canada Wildlife Act, similar in a sense to the Fisheries Act, although the numbers, note here, of course, that the numbers here ever only got as high as 30. So the number of prosecutions in 2005 were 30, but then they quickly dropped in 2006, have not ever exceeded 10 up until 2009 in the 5 years they're sampled. And then convictions, from in the last 3 years of the sampled period, 0 convictions. under the Act. And so I think with these kinds of numbers, I think it's appropriate to sort of recall what relationship, if any, exists between enforcement and deterrence. And while I can't claim that my research for the purposes of this presentation was exhaustive, what I did find suggests that the two are in fact very much related. So assessing Ontario's 1990s experiment with smart regulation, DeMarco and Weigott observed a correlation between decreased emphasis on enforcement measures and or capacity and an increase in pollution exceedances. So this was an article published in the JELP in 2007. An earlier work by Dr. Diane Sachs, who is now Ontario's Eco Commissioner, also supports the relationship between enforcement and specifically prosecution in driving deterrence. And so she surveyed 100 major Canadian corporations with respect to their environmental performance and how it would be affected by various policies. And she found, again, that the results supported a greater emphasis on prosecution. This is a 1990 article published in the JELP as well. Unfortunately, not only is enforcement activity too low, much of the activity that is occurring is often ineffective and unresponsive to the actual threats to regulators' objectives. And so here we can consider any one of several chapters of the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development's reports to Parliament. And so in the time that I have, I'll just go over some of the highlights as against Environment Canada, Transport Canada, and the National Energy Board. And so beginning with Environment Canada and its enforcement of SEPA 99, the CSD's 2011 report identified several serious shortcomings. So the Environmental Enforcement Directorate lacked key information on regulated individuals and companies to know whether it is targeting its enforcement activities toward the highest risk violators or the highest risks to human health and the environment as called for by its own policy. The Directorate failed to follow up on its own enforcement actions during the audit period to verify that violators returned to compliance with applicable regulations, and Environment Canada was not measuring the results of its enforcement activities and actions and did not know whether they were achieving their program objectives of encouraging compliance and minimizing damage and threats to the environment. With respect to Transport Canada and the National Energy Board that same year, and here with respect to the transportation of dangerous products, the CSD observed that Transport Canada lacked a consistent approach to planning and implementing compliance activities. Transport Canada had not ensured that corrective action had been taken on instances of noncompliance. In the sample of completed inspection files reviewed, 53% identified instances of noncompliance, and of those only as much as 73% contained incomplete or no evidence that corrective action had been taken. The CSD noted that these issues were not new for Transport Canada. An internal audit identified the same concerns 5 years earlier, and the department had yet to correct some of those key weaknesses. With respect to the NEB, although it had identified gaps and deficiencies through its verification of compliance for the companies it regulated, there was little indication that it had followed up to ensure that these deficiencies had been corrected. 64% of the files audited identified gaps and deficiencies, and of those, only 7% contained evidence that the board had followed up to determine if corrective actions had been taken. With respect to the NEB most recently, on the topic of tracking pipeline company compliance, the CSD again concluded that although there had been some improvement, the NEB's tracking of company compliance with pipeline approval conditions was inadequate, and further that the information management systems used by the board were not integrated with each other and were outdated and inefficient. So there are other reports, both at the federal and provincial level. The Cohen Commission, obviously in British Columbia, with respect to the Fisheries Act, made several findings with respect to compliance and enforcement. A recent Auditor General report in Alberta looked at the recent work of the Alberta Energy Regulator, and although I would suggest that the Alberta Energy Regulator is probably doing one of the best jobs right now in Canada, there are also problems identified there. So the question, of course, then becomes, where do we go from there? And I won't pretend to have the answer to this question, but I do have a few ideas that I want to share with the time that I have left. And so the first is to recognize that this is a systemic issue across Canada. And in that context, I think it's useful to consider the usual suspects facing regulators across the country. And so here we are talking about agencies that are underfunded, understaffed, and subjected to the political and ideological whims of different governments and the influence that has. There was a recent story, for instance, about officers at Environment Canada and the impact of mixed messaging from at the political level. I think a second point, second idea is to acknowledge that effective enforcement and compliance are difficult. And actually probably especially difficult in the last decade as various regulators, both federally and at the provincial level, have begun to embrace this risk-based approach to regulation and enforcement. And so risk-based regulation is deceptively simple in its concept, but actually quite difficult to apply in practice. And so the deceptively simple idea here is that regulators should focus their increasingly limited resources on those risks that pose the greatest threat to the achievement of their objectives. But in practice, this is really hard and requires significant resources. It requires the continuous assimilation of new information to verify whether, in fact, those main risks, those high risks, are in fact being addressed, and whether or not there are new emerging ones. It also requires significant coordination between branches and personnel both within the department and outside, to ensure that everyone is operating on the basis of the same risk assessments. And I think this is particularly important to note where in the Canadian model, at the federal level at least, where oftentimes the decision about whether to proceed or not with an enforcement action is one that is made with the department, but also, for instance, with prosecutors with the PPSC. And so I think it's very important that in that context, everyone is aware of any risk-based framework that has been applied to ensure that it is being followed. I think a final point in terms of ideas going forward, of course, is to start with those audits and the results of the CSD. I think that that's an intuitive starting point to start addressing some of the sort of chronic problems within enforcement and compliance where those audits have been carried out. So my final thing that I wanted to share with you today is a bit of a note of caution. And what I'm referring here is to the Ernst fracking litigation. Some of you may be familiar with. Essentially, Ms. Ernst is suing Encana Corporation, but also the Alberta Energy Regulator and Alberta Environment and Parks for the alleged contamination of her groundwater as a result of negligent fracking activities. And so it's a straightforward private claim of negligence against Encana, but she's also alleging essentially regulatory negligence against the Alberta Energy Regulator and Alberta Environment and Parks. And so a few things have happened in the context of this case that I think make it one that's worth watching. We've had several motions to strike. The first by the Alberta Energy Regulator, which was successful, but a subsequent one by Alberta Environment and Parks, which was not successful. And looking at those two decisions, it becomes, I think, very clear that this is a sort of unstable, dynamic area of law with where it's very hard to predict what the consequences are going to be. There's also, at a higher level, a decision from the Federal Court of Appeal last year, Parity Honey, wherein Justice Stratus essentially suggests that we should abolish this whole notion of the private tort liability of government officials and agencies, and rather that it should all be done sort of under administrative law tests and principles. So clearly an unstable area of law that it becomes difficult to predict how it's going to end. And so certainly I think agencies across the country should be watching this to see what it means for them. I think the other very interesting thing about the Ernst fracking litigation is this charter argument that Ms. Ernst has made, in which she was recently before the Supreme Court of Canada on, essentially alleging not just regulatory negligence, but that the Alberta Energy Regulator breached her Section 2 charter rights when it essentially refused to communicate with her with respect to her concerns at one point. And so she's sort of alleging and invoking the charter here. And I think that although the Section 2 argument is novel and fairly unique, I think it is safe to say that individuals will increasingly be looking to the Charter and perhaps Section 7 and its protection of life, liberty, and security of the person as a basis for challenging these situations where there appears to be some kind of negligence or anyways insufficient attention being paid by regulators to the threats being faced by landowners and communities generally. And so I think that's something to be looking out for, and it provides an additional impetus to get on with fixing the approach in Canada to compliance and enforcement. Thank you much for your time. Thank you very much for your time. As I mentioned, please don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions about this presentation or some of the papers that are referred to it. And I hope you have enjoy the rest of your conference.
We'll thank him. So, thank you, Martin. I think actually Martin is watching us on the web, so again, we appreciate that overview very much. It was a fascinating talk. Can we now move on to the federal perspective on inspections and compliance? And I mentioned that, and your program indicates that the first speaker will be Heather McCready, who is Executive Director of Environmental Enforcement at Environment and Climate Change Canada. However, I neglected to mention that Heather has been good enough to bring along a real enforcement person, John Senkai, who is Operations Manager and Interpol Liaison at Environment and Climate Change Canada. That's a mouthful, you know. Heather.
Good morning, everyone. Big thank you to Martin for warming up the crowd with a vigorous presentation. He and I and Jamie have had a pretty spirited discussion over the last week or so preparing for this, and it's been a lot of fun. I'd also like to thank Martin for making the link between enforcement and deterrence, which is something that I believe there is a link. I believe that the work we do is really important. So I'm the Executive Director of Environmental Enforcement at Environment and Climate Change Canada. So what does that mean? I'm in charge of what I guess you would call the headquarters region, where we do the planning, reporting, organizing, response to media, service up the chain work. And in the regions, in the rest of Canada, we have people who are actually doing the real work of enforcement. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a recovering lawyer. I was a corporate lawyer in the U.S. from 2007 to 2009. If you know your history, that was during the financial crisis. So I'm very happy to be a public servant, in part because of that experience and in part because I really love the work that I do. I always wanted to be an environmental lawyer when I was in law school, and now I feel like I'm actually doing environmental law for real, which is a great privilege. So I don't have a paper for this session. I'm presenting a paper tomorrow. What John and I are going to do is give you an overview of federal environmental enforcement, specifically focusing on inspections, because that's the topic of this morning's session. And since I'm presenting tomorrow, I thought I would phone a friend so you don't have too much of me speaking. And John's going to do the more interesting half of the presentation, where he's going to make it more real for you. We wanted you to be able to walk in the steel-toed boots of an enforcement officer for a short time this morning. So we're going to start by talking about, there we go, Environment and Climate Change Canada's enforcement branch. We're going to talk about how we do inspection planning. Then John's going to take it over with a day in the life of an enforcement officer. And we're going to conclude with responses to alleged violations and then be happy to take your questions. So let's start off with the evolution of federal environmental enforcement. There have been several key milestones since 2005 that I wanted to highlight for you. The first is that in 2005, we became a separate branch at Environment Canada. So for those of you outside of the bureaucracy, who cares? So you change the org chart a little bit. What does that really mean? What it meant for us is that we became independent from the department. Decisions about enforcement are made by enforcement officers. We are not the people who make the regulations. We do participate in the process of making regulations, but we are not the regulators. We are the enforcers. And that independence actually means a lot in terms of how we run ourselves and how we govern our business. There were also some additions to our budget over time. And then in 2009, you see the Environmental Enforcement Act. So Martin was talking about getting tough on environmental crime. This is how we're getting tough on environmental crime. The minimum fines increased quite significantly under the Environmental Enforcement Act. What we're seeing now is where parties used to plead out in the past because paying the fine was really just the cost of doing business. We're now seeing people actually challenge these cases in court. That means that we're going to win some and we're going to lose some. And where we lose some, we're going to learn a lot from that and come back stronger and win the next ones. In 2010, we had a concerted effort to increase staff at headquarters. That can be controversial because obviously we want to put most of our resources in the field where the real work is happening. But a lot of the planning, reporting, measuring of our work, being able to share that information with Canadians accurately, all of that has to be done by the center where we do a lot of that measuring. And that work is really difficult to do and requires resources. More importantly, that initiative in 2010 is what hired me, so I'm a fan. A little snapshot of our enforcement branch. We have about 400 staff in total. Approximately 260 of those are badged officers. We have two groups of enforcement officers. We have the wildlife enforcement officers who enforce all of the wildlife acts and regulations, and then we have what we call environmental enforcement officers who handle the pollution side of the house. So both of these two streams of enforcement report up to one chief enforcement officer. Our enforcement officers have the powers of peace officers to enforce our laws and regulations. We are not inspectors and investigators separately. We are both inspectors and investigators combined. So we have that entire suite of powers under us. We have offices all across the country, as you can see. John works out of River Road in Ottawa. These are all of our enforcement responsibilities, and there are quite a lot of them. So we enforce all of the federal environmental laws and regulations, again, divided between both of the wildlife stream and the environment stream. But if you take the environment stream, which is where I work and where John works, there is quite a breadth of things that our enforcement officers are responsible for. Everything from the dry cleaner on the corner to massive natural resources extraction companies. And the amount of knowledge that you have to do that is quite significant. Our officers are trained to be law enforcement professionals, and that is the focus of the training that we offer them. They also have to understand a little bit of how facilities operate, so a bit of engineering, a bit of chemistry, a bit of biology. We are supported by experts within Environment Canada, and we often contract out for specific knowledge that we need. We can't do this alone. We work a lot with partners. Probably our most important partners are our provincial counterparts, so I'm really happy that Jamie is here today. We work quite closely with them out of our regional offices. We also work with federal partners, obviously. As I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, environmental problems don't present themselves neatly packaged for our bureaucratic silos. There probably is no exclusive Environment Canada problem. There's no one problem that's just my directorate. So we have to work together to really understand those problems and have a concerted effort to solve them. We also work quite a lot with international partners, including the U.S. EPA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which is part of NAFTA, as well as Interpol. Some people don't know that Interpol actually does environmental work in addition to all the other things you may have seen on TV and in the movies. And we have two officers who go to the Interpol National Central Bureau in Ottawa and are our liaisons there, and John is one of them. I also sit on the Pollution Crime Working Group of Interpol. Our principal activities. One of them is intelligence. This is really important because I'm going to talk about it a lot tomorrow, so you can stay tuned for that. We're doing a lot to improve our intelligence program, and that will be the focus of my presentation tomorrow. What we're doing with intelligence is not just supporting investigations once they've happened, but trying to integrate it into our planning and priority setting so that we can pick the biggest targets and understand the best ways to intervene in those situations. As I mentioned, we conduct inspections, which is the main focus of the presentation this morning, and our officers also handle investigations and then take things all the way up to laying charges, which is where we turn things over to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada to run it into the finish line. So I'd like to talk a minute about planned versus reactive inspections. So planned inspections are the things that we plan in advance, where we try to figure out what we think the most important environmental problems are and assign inspections as part of a strategy to address those problems. a lot of the work that we do is reactive. Things happen in the world and our officers respond to them. Those are typically the things that you're going to see on the news right away. So those are your train derailments, pipeline breaks, tailings ponds breach, things like that. Those are the things that happen often without warning that we need to respond to. So that takes up a big chunk of the work that we do. Because they're unplanned and we don't see them coming, we have to juggle between what we plan to do and then what we need to respond to. And when something happens, to figure out if we really need to respond, are we the best placed agency, and what's the extent of our response? And we balance that with our planned inspections. Every year, we revisit what it is that we're doing in terms of planning. Our planning process is actually evolving quite significantly, and I think we're getting a lot better at working with our partners and figuring out how to address the most important environmental problems. But no plan survives first contact with implementation. So we do our best to plan out what we're going to do for the year, and then we have to be able to respond to what happens. What happens in terms of reactive things, and also what happens when we go out and conduct our planned inspections. We need to course correct based on what we see actually happening in real life. This is my last slide, then I'm going to turn it over to John, where it gets more fun. I wanted to talk about what motivates me in terms of planning and some of the ideas that inspire me. So you see here a triangle, a pyramid. There's a much fancier name for it, but we like to call it the triangle of badness or the pyramid of badness. So this is all the people we regulate. And the generally accepted theory is that most people either want to comply or would comply, aren't necessarily out there purposely trying to break the law in some sort of nefarious way. But there is a percentage at the top of the pyramid who are not going to comply, and the only way to make them comply is to apply the force of law, and that's where John comes in. Then there are people who don't want to comply. We're looking at motivation to deter. Then we have people who are willing to comply but don't always succeed. Here you might have smaller businesses who don't have the wherewithal to understand all of the various things that apply to them or necessarily put in place the procedures they need to comply properly, and they may need some support. And then you have people who are more open to building a whole environmental protection ethic. So these are your best people. So here's how we approach these things, and here are some of the ideas that really motivate me. The first thing that I'm always pushing us to do is to understand the problem. Environmental problems are very complicated. As I mentioned, they often involve a lot of different mandates and a lot of different disciplines. And if we're actually going to solve the problem, we have to first understand what it is. That takes collaborating with people with Inside Environment and Climate Change Canada, with our federal and provincial partners, with people like you, with anybody who has an idea about what's going on that we need to be working on. Now, if you have read The Regulatory Craft by Malcolm Sparrow, which I know Jamie has, we've had some good discussions about that. I'm a huge fan of his work and have been heavily influenced by that. So understand the problem, find big problems, and devote your resources to solving them. Another thing that we're doing more and more is using intelligence to understand and identify the worst offenders, and also to figure out where the best points of intervention are. Here I've been influenced quite a lot by Jerry Radcliffe, whose seminal work on intel-led policing will come up tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about how at Environment and Climate Change Canada we are adapting the principles of intelligence-led policing to an environmental and regulatory context to get better and better at the work that we're doing. Once you understand the problem and you understand the best ways of intervening, you need to tailor your solution to that problem. The solution to every problem is not always enforcement. There's the expression that when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we're a hammer, and I look at the world looking for nails to hammer. But the problem is not always a nail and may require a screwdriver or some sandpaper or something completely different to solve that problem. So that's where we need to work with other people within the Government of Canada to figure out exactly what it is that will push people towards doing the thing that we need them to do. You may have heard of the concept of nudging. That's something else that's influenced my work quite a bit. I would describe enforcement as a shove. Not every problem needs a shove. Shoves are quite expensive. There are ways to influence larger groups of people through nudging and through understanding what are the obstacles to behavioral change. What is that little button you can push on someone that's going to push them in the right direction? And that is not always enforcement. And then finally, we need to measure our results and continuously improve. That's really easy to say. It's really hard to do. We need data. We need experts to help us understand things. We need Audits. I'm actually glad that Martin raised some of the audits. I'm perversely a huge fan of audits. I love when external actors come in and look at the work that we do. Often they're uncovering problems that I know are there, and what they do is they focus the attention of the department on fixing those problems. So it often gives public servants the motivation and the push that we need to do the things that we know we need to do, but don't necessarily have the time or the bureaucratic thrust to get done. But a big part of our planning process right now is we start by trying to understand the problem. We tailor an intervention to that problem. We go out, we intervene, and then we need to stop and say, okay, we did something. What did that something do? Were we able to push the dial? If not, why? Sometimes we'll think there's an enforcement problem. We'll go out, we'll find out that there isn't. That's great news. That means we can put an X in that box and move on to the next thing. But unless we take that moment to stand back and evaluate our work and then course correct, we won't be able to take advantage of what we're seeing in front of us. So that's the end of my bureaucratic part of this presentation. I'm now going to turn it over to John, who's going to walk you through a day in his life.
To the right. All right. Hello, everybody. So I'm John Senkai. I'm an operations manager for Environment Canada. I still say Environment Canada because I can't get the rest of the words out of my mouth, so just bear with me on that. But I am located here in the Ottawa region. I've been with the department for 13 years now, all with enforcement. I supervise a team in Eastern and Northern Ontario, so that's primarily my experience and with the environmental component. But we will be going over wildlife examples as well. So I just want to give you an example of the breadth of work our guys do in the field. So just a lot of pictures, a lot of exciting pictures. This is not one of them, but it's a reality of the job. Paperwork, majority of our regulations under the acts have reporting requirements. So we want our guys in the field. We really do, but there is realities that they have to review reports quite frequent basis. One of the advantages of reviewing reports is that they may indicate issues that trigger an on-site inspection. So you review a report, you find some issues, it may trigger an officer actually showing up at your door. So that's one example there. So when you're on site, so this is a picture of a bin of waste PERC, tetrachloroethylene. So we have federal dry cleaning regulation. And this is this is one of the situations we've encountered during an inspection. Tetrachloroethylene is highly carcinogenic. So when our officers do these inspections, and we'll get into some OSH components here in a second, you'll see respirators, protective equipment, et cetera. So this is a particularly bad incident. Dry cleaners have issues in the past. We recently just had jail time for a dry cleaner that we got just this week. He was a bit of a recidivist. They had encountered this type of issue over and over and over again. In addition to the OSH concern to our officers, there's an OSH concern to customers, to the regulatee himself. Certain inspections that we've conducted, we've had to contact the Ministry of Labour in Ontario to do an occupational health and safety inspection as well. So one example there. You'll see here an officer sampling PCB contaminated soil. So you see the respirator, you see the protective clothing, and also a comment on the sampling aspect. So this is a bit of a technical skill a lot of our officers will have to have. So this is this type of inspection would be done primarily under the PCB regulations. Just to give you a contrast, so you go from a site in a city primarily where you're going to do a PCB inspection or a PERC inspection, dry cleaning inspection, to this. So this is the Ring of Fire. It's a mining exploratory region, Northern Ontario, accessible only by float plane. We've inspected these under the Federal Fisheries Act, so you have a summer picture and obviously the winter picture. The issue here is abandoned mines. So the picture in the top right, that's on a lake, something we uncovered or discovered during an inspection. A lot of those containers there are aviation fuel containers that the owner of the land had no intention of returning to. These are small companies. They're looking to tap into that chromite vein. If they hit it, they'll sell it to the two main companies up there. If they don't, they leave. It's very expensive to get this stuff back, so they'll leave their snow machines up there, they'll leave their ATVs up there, they'll leave their aviation fuel. I think you see a fridge back there. So just to give you a contrast of the type of work our guys do. So they're in a float plane one day, and then they're in downtown Toronto in a dingy dry cleaner perhaps the next day. Very, very diverse. Our officers do all of this, right? So they have to have a lot of training, a lot of OSH training in general, but a lot of technical training, and they have to obviously know the regulations. Our guys are at the borders as well. The picture on the left, you'll see a container full of computer monitors, often referred to as e-waste. We have import-export hazardous waste regulations, belongs to under the Basel Convention, so we have international obligations there. Usually shipped to China or Western Africa. Another example of a completely different type of inspection than the ones I just showed you. Again, same officers conducted them, different OSH components, different regulatory components. These are done under SEPA as well. And you'll see a couple officers talking to truckers. So that's another thing I would like to focus, a different type of clientele our officers will experience. You'll experience truckers in this place. You'll experience a dry cleaner who may or may not know English. Often the case, English is not their first language. To an angry farmer in the back country. So the officers do get a lot of training on interacting with people, how to deal with different sets of people, different types of people. So just another example of the variability. These are Fisheries Act inspections. The picture on your left there, that is a pulp and paper mill, and that's the final discharge point. So what the officer there is doing is filling a bucket to fill into another bucket to send that bucket to the lab for testing. So there is some OSH components there. He does have a PFD on. I believe he's also tethered. That's an industrial type inspection. Other types of Fisheries Act inspections you'll see here. Sometimes we just find random pipes, if you can believe that or not. Storm outfalls, you'll find those. We'll get complaints. The picture on the bottom right with that lovely black liquid coming out, that's also a pulp and paper mill. That's all called black liquor, but that's a process waste of the pulp and paper industry. And the top picture is just a complaint we received from the public of a random, I believe it was a municipally owned storage, outfall that had something coming out of it. So often we'll get a complaint, we'll kind of have to track back to the source to determine what. So again, completely different, and this is a completely different type of inspection than, say, being at the border for a day. All right, who doesn't like turtles? So I showed you the first slides there, primarily inspections under the Federal Fisheries Act and the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Obviously, I work on the environmental side, so that's my experience. This is an inspection conducted by our Wildlife Directorate. This file in particular is in the Cornwall region. These turtles were being smuggled across the St. Lawrence via boat. It's a known smuggling route for many things, including cigarettes. But this guy had many turtles amongst other species that are listed in the CITES Convention that we uncovered. And this was a joint operation with CBSA. It was a joint operation with U.S. Fish and Game. We mentioned earlier that we're involved with Interpol. I am one of the liaisons there. This is the type of work that we generate from Interpol to make those connections with CBSA, with other international partners. Those tips are crucial to make things like this happen. Without it, very difficult to get information to enforce this. All right, so what you have here is a Learjet on tarmac in Winnipeg, and our wildlife partners there arrested the 3 men from the plane who were from Mexico. They flew up from Monterey. They shot some polar bears. They bought some narwhal tusks, and then they decided to fly back. It's not necessarily illegal to shoot polar bear. You need permits, though. We got a tip. When they refueled in Winnipeg, when they came back from the Arctic, they refueled in Winnipeg. They were arrested. As you can tell, these were men they're well off, so they paid their $80,000 fine the next day, and then they flew back to Mexico. So again, this is a completely different type of inspection. We got this information off a tip. Again, partnerships very important in our line of work, so we could, counteract this type of situation. All right, last, I think, picture here. So what you have here, top left, is a flare at a gas plant. What you have on the right, on the other pictures, are thousands and thousands of dead birds. For those who don't know, gas plants or petroleum refining facilities, if they do have flaring, it's usually an indication of a process upset or something not going well in the plant. In this case, I believe they were doing some upgrades, so they're flaring a lot of the methane off. Usually they'd want to reincorporate this fuel back into the system, not waste it. It's a fuel, or they could sell it in some cases. In this case, they flared excessively at night in dense fog and during migratory bird season, which resulted these birds essentially flying into 1,000°C flare, which many were incinerated on the spot, and I think it was roughly around 8,000 dead birds. This was in St. John, New Brunswick. Happy result, we got a fine for $750,000. So again, completely different inspection from all the other ones I've showed you. Again, just giving an example of the breadth and differences that our officers experience on a daily basis. So, response to alleged violations, I'll just go over some of the main ones we do here. I don't think these are going to be too new to some of you. Warnings, tickets. We have ticketing in some provinces, not all provinces, so that is a limitation on our part. I know the last presentation was a bit critical, but this is a gap we have. Ticketing is useful for a lot of those instances where we're not going to recommend prosecution. Generally speaking, if we're going to recommend prosecution, we have to pick and choose our battles or pick and choose our files that we know our PPSC is going to be interested in. I see some of my PPSC members here. I know I've had that conversation extensively over the years. So ticketing is a valuable tool to kind of alleviate that problem, but unfortunately it's not available in all the provinces. Directions and orders, essentially those are just what they say, directions that relate to the Fisheries Act. Orders, compliance orders relate to the Environmental Protection Act. Those are the ones we use most. Generally speaking, if you violate an order, our compliance and enforcement policy, which is the next slide, recommends a prosecution. So it's also considered an aggravating factor in our responses as well. Some of these other things we don't do it too often. I don't know if Heather's going to speak about ministerial orders in the City of Montreal. No, you will not. All right. Fantastic. But we do have some remarkable powers. We can detain ships. We haven't done that very often, but we can. Injunctions, we could do that as well, but it's not terribly common. And our compliance and enforcement policies under the various acts. They're getting a little dated. They do need to be updated. They are public documents. I know when we've had prosecutions in the past, Defense Counsel usually has these, or they've asked us questions about them, right? So they will kind of compare our actions to what's in the act. So it's very important that our officers are able to explain their actions and how it relates to the acts or to the policies. And then these are the three main things that our officers would consider through the policies in terms of what type of enforcement action they would choose. So the nature of the alleged violation. So what that means is the difference between a 100 million liter spill of diesel into a lake that caused a massive fish kill versus, something relatively minor, a cow, defecating in a creek, for example, right? So there's some different scales in terms of the nature of the alleged violation. Part of the nature of the alleged violation also is the intent. If it was done intentionally, well, obviously that's going to get a different response from us than if it was, an accident where due diligence was exercised. Effectiveness of measuring and achieving the desired result, well, that is our main goal in terms of we would like to restore compliance as soon as possible. So whatever tool we have to get you into compliance or the regular team into compliance as soon as possible will be the right one. So it's not necessarily using the hammer for the minor issues. And finally, and this does prove to be difficult at times, consistency in enforcement. So if we're Environment Canada, so we have companies that operate in all our jurisdictions. If a company receives a direction in Halifax for a certain set of circumstances, they're going to expect that same reaction for the same same circumstances in BC. And that's something we struggle with at times. Every file is very unique from my experience, but it's something that we do strive for, something that is communicated often to the officers, and that they do take into account in selecting their enforcement actions. So I believe that is the end of our presentations. All right.
Do you have questions for us?
Thank you very much. Okay, we already have some questions here, and we'll bring our web people in first. There's a question from the web for Heather. What's the difference between reactive inspections and investigations?
Okay, so a lot. An inspection is where we're using our inspection powers, which are actually quite broad. To paraphrase a little bit glibly, we have reason to believe that there is a substance or an activity that we regulate in a given place. We can go anywhere, look at anything, open any barrel, ask for assistance. When our officers, this is actually more of a question for you, but I'll take it anyway. When our officers have reasons to believe that a violation has actually occurred. So in inspection, we have reasons to believe that there is a regulated substance or activity, and that's why we're there. When we have reason to believe that an infraction has actually occurred, that's when we're in investigation mode. And that triggers charter considerations. That's at a point where if we need something, we're going to be getting a search warrant. If we're questioning somebody, we're doing charter cautions. That's where we're looking to either to investigate to figure out whether or not we're going to bring something to prosecution. So an investigation could come from an unplanned or reactive inspection. So Lac-Mégantic is an excellent example. Lac-Mégantic happened. We didn't plan for that. We reacted to that and sent people out in inspection mode first, and then they had reasonable grounds to believe that a violation of the Fisheries Act had occurred, and we've since laid charges. That answers that. And you can jump in on that if you want.
Yeah, just a little thing. Generally speaking, an inspection of some type is always conducted prior to an investigation. If it's a Lac-Mégantic type of situation, obviously you're going to get there and you'll be like, oh my God, your elements of the offense are met, and the nature of the alleged violation that we just kind of talked about seems fairly severe. It makes sense to go into an investigation fairly quickly in that circumstance. But sometimes it's not that apparent. We'll collect a lot of information first before we decide to go into the investigative mode.
This is a question that's very to the point, and it raises another question I think of. It's for John. It was, what was the source of the tip that resulted in the interdiction of Mexican polar bear hunters? And it raises a sort of a bigger question, this one. I'm not too sure if that was a CITES case or not. It could be framed in different ways, but you mentioned CITES at one point, and it raises the whole question of interjurisdictional cooperation, which both of you have referred to. There's federal, provincial, obviously, but also within the federal government. I often think of CITES automatically as involving customs agents, for example, so I was a little surprised to hear Environment Canada also had a role in it.
Unfortunately, I don't know the source of the tip.
Okay.
I could find that information out if the person wanted to contact me.
The tipster may not want to be revealed.
Yeah, anonymous as well.
As to the broader issue, though, of how you manage interjurisdictional cooperation or intra-agency cooperation, if it's just federal government, both of you alluded to this, but I guess it'd be interesting to hear some of the nitty-gritty about how you actually do this, especially where, for example, you have federal and provincial environment ministries who may have different priorities, who may have a different approach to, say, risk-based assessment. Can you give us any insight in terms of how that works out?
Sure. So partnerships, as John mentioned, are extremely important in the work that we do. And there are different ways to approach partnerships. In order for us to have an institutional relationship, we typically have an MOU or some sort of agreement with that other agency. So we have in place, I'd say probably with every single environment ministry in every province, some sort of formal agreement that says we will play nicely together, and these are the parameters by which we will play nicely together. We will share information, we'll talk to each other, et cetera. We also have that with other federal partners. We all understand where our lines are in terms of this is your jurisdiction, this is our jurisdiction. But how the rubber actually hits the road, things can get a little messy. So it's important to understand who focuses on what and who focuses on the other thing and how we're going to collaborate. So that's the institutional relationship. What's also very important is the individual relationships that we have. So in our regions, our regional directors and the managers and officers all have relationships with their provincial counterparts. And those are really important. It's important to invest in those relationships, meet with those people regularly, have those contacts so that when something happens, you're thinking of each other. And you have that trust that is really important in law enforcement to share information. We do the same thing with international partners. I was just down in the U.S. Back in January meeting with the EPA. We are cooperating on a large file you may have heard of that involves cars. So that's something that's brought us together recently. But they're a very important partner in the work that we do. You mentioned customs. So CITES is actually enforced by our Wildlife Directorate, but they obviously need the participation and support of CBSA, our customs officers, because things are coming across the border and it's CBSA that's there. So as I mentioned earlier, environmental problems are very complex and very broad in nature. And if we just focused on our one little silo, we wouldn't even be getting the tip of the iceberg of the issue. So we require that partnership and support from all those other agencies.
I wonder, John, if you could speak to some of the practical aspects in terms of how you would deal with your provincial counterparts, because I assume that if you see something being dumped into a stream, that might be a violation of the Fisheries Act. It may well also be a violation of provincial
Absolutely. So in Ontario, we do have an interjurisdictional protocol that it kind of outlines what Environment Canada is responsible for and what the provinces and other agencies are responsible for. The example I can give is pulp and paper and the metal mining sectors. Both are regulated federally and provincially. So if I have a metal mining facility that has violations, we'll definitely look at it. The first thing we'll do, I'll have my officers contact the province so they can also get their 2 cents in, make their assessment. We've done joint prosecutions in the past, federally and provincially together, where the province would look at certain aspects and we would look at certain other aspects, but the investigators would work together. But in certain cases, other cases, if the province is first, and by first I mean they're more engaged in the investigation or in the response, we'll back off. We won't duplicate the resources, and vice versa. So it's happened both ways. I know there's been times where the province hasn't been necessarily interested in certain files, so we've kind of stepped in to fill that gap. But so it's a little ad hoc in every region, every province. You'll find some variability.
A question on the compliance approach pyramid shows that Environment Canada and Climate Change supports to comply those organizations willing to comply but who are unsuccessful. How is this support offered and how can it be improved? And the writer notes, as a person in charge of environmental management at a federal property, sometimes there is an important piece missing between identifying noncompliance and attaining our shared objectives. And perhaps you have some particular cases you can refer to there too.
Sure. So we have a group at Environment Canada that works on compliance promotion. So they do a lot of education for regulatees, explaining how regulations work. Also within each of the regulations, particularly under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, they have risk managers who are in charge of that substance, that regulation, who know a lot about that area. And those two groups together provide a lot of compliance promotion support. They'll go to trade shows, industry associations, and do presentations, answer questions on those sorts of regulations, which is what they do. We don't go out and work for a company and become their compliance officer. That is an obligation of the regulatee. Everybody has to comply with the law, and you have to put in place the mechanisms to comply with the law. It is obligatory. But there is a lot of thought put around education and making sure that people understand the regulations. And that pyramid, by the way, is an official Environment Canada policy. It's how a lot of people look at the general pool of regulators and how we want to approach them.
Okay, thank you. Here's sort of an interesting contemporary question. Does Environment Canada and Climate Change utilize social media in enforcement activities? For example, do your officers set up fake Facebook accounts, etc., to gather intelligence?
If we did, I couldn't tell you.
Fair enough.
But we do use social media. We do look through social media, use it as a tool. It's been used in investigations. It's very common these days.
Okay. This, of course, is a current issue right now in the States in terms of security, but presumably the same sorts of issues come up in terms of environmental enforcement as well. So, I guess one question I do have is the reference to the U.S. EPA and the trans-border cooperation, particularly, and this has both, I guess, legal aspects, but also practical aspects along the border. We've got much of our border is, of course, shared waters. How does that interchange actually work? Is it at a policy level primarily? Is it work primarily at a practical level? The U.S. EPA is obviously much larger than anything we've got in Canada.
Do you want to know specifically about water or general?
No, just generally.
Okay. So Canada cooperates a lot with the United States, which makes a lot of sense, obviously, particularly in terms of trade. They are, I think, our biggest trading partner. And there's been a lot of work done over the past several years to align regulations with the U.S. and Canada. So you may have heard of something called the Regulatory Cooperation Council and the Beyond the Border Initiative. So these are two interconnected initiatives that are aligning regulations with the U.S. and Canada. It supports trade. It allows for us to have a North American market where things can move back and forth across the border more easily. So a lot of our regulations are very similar to the U.S. for that reason, so that regulatees have one set of rules they need to comply with. So we cooperate at very, very high levels that don't involve John or I at all, and we cooperate at more practical levels. So on a file that I'm working on right now, I'm involved at a more senior level with the EPA of talking with them just generally about shared priorities, how we're going to collaborate together, issues that we're spotting on both sides of the border. Whenever you sit down with anybody from another enforcement agency, it's pretty quick that we're like, yes, me too. Yeah, I saw that as well. So talking about the different things that we have in common. And what I've tried to do on this file is open up a door for the officer who's leading the file to bring him. I brought him with me to the U.S. recently to meet with their lead investigators so that they can have that relationship at the file level. So we do it at all different levels. The RCC and the Beyond the Border Initiative are way above my pay grade, but they're the sort of thing that facilitate the rest of the work that we do. When we actually have to take evidence from another country and use it in court, that's where it gets very formal. That's where you need a mutual legal assistance treaty mechanism to get that evidence and use it in the right way. But there's a lot of informal cooperation that happens on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is a mutual legal assistance treaty between Canada and the U.S., and if there's going to be a formal transfer of evidence that will be used in court, it has to go through that process. So.
Can I just have a sort of footnote to that question? I can remember when I used to work on acid precipitation as an issue. Well, one of the really interesting things about the trans-border arrangements there was the significant role played by some provincial governments, especially Ontario and Quebec, to the point where, at least at a high level of policy, I think at one point you had the Minister of Environment for Ontario actually leading a Canadian delegation. So is this something that happens at a lower level as well, involving the provinces as well as the two federal governments?
Sure, as John was mentioning, sometimes it's about who's the best placed agency. We can't be everywhere all the time. Neither agency can. So if it makes more sense for one party to be leading on a file, that's what they do, and that would also pertain to something that's cross-border. It really depends on whose mandate's triggered more squarely. And what some people don't understand is that the provinces are not junior partners to the federal government. It's not like there's a hierarchy that the federal government's in charge and then the provinces are under that. And we're equal partners in a lot of this. So we sit at the table equally in a lot of these situations. Obviously, foreign affairs is the mandate of the federal government. But when it comes to partnerships and working around issues, I think we all, get over that and figure out who the right person is to be leading a particular issue.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank both our speakers. It was fascinating. And because this is Canada, of course, you know that following a federal perspective, as night follows day, we are going to have the provincial perspective, and we're delighted to have with us Jamie Flegel, who is counsel with the Ontario Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change.
Okay. Good morning. So, when I was asked to do this panel, I called up, I have two colleagues here, Fred Maves and Paul McCulloch, and they're over there. And Paul McCulloch said to me, "Why are they asking you?" He's right. I haven't really dealt with enforcement and inspection issues probably in about a decade. Since I worked on enforcement legislation, it was the You Spill, You Pay bill from 2005, where the ministry introduced environmental penalties. And I've thought about these issues deeply for some time because I went over to the side of doing a lot of legislation on water. Things like the Clean Water Act, which is drinking water source protection, and the Lake Cycle Protection Act, Great Lakes Protection Act, watershed planning, that sort of thing. But where is Michael? I don't know if he's even here. Is he here, Michael Fortier? No? When he phoned me, I think he probably phoned me because there was a session at the Ontario Bar Association where I kept on getting up and asking questions. And he thought, let's get that guy to come talk. And here I am, and when I started at the Ministry of Environment, which was then just the Ministry of Environment, somehow climate change is now, of course, very important, but we have to highlight it in the name. I actually started doing litigation and prosecutions, and I was hired by Mr. Jack Coop, who's way back there, and he was my principal. And that's a great thing about the public service. It's that sort of place that you walk in, it's a Friday, and he says, there's a hearing coming up on Monday. Can you do it? Okay, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what's involved. And you basically hit the ground running. And after that, I got involved in the development of legislation, but I was glad that the actual practice with respect to litigation and prosecutions gave you insight when you were developing legislation about the sort of issues that you have to deal with when you're before a tribunal, when you're before a court, and you're having to explain all these issues. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I thought, okay, let's go back and, number one, start looking at the case law again on inspections. Why not? We're lawyers. And number two, I'll take off my lawyer hat. And what does the theory say about compliance and enforcement? And a lot of the stuff that you heard Martin and Heather talk about, you're going to hear again. Heck, you're going to see the pyramid again, because it's all about the pyramid. So I first want to get into the case law, because there was a time after the charter was introduced in the 80s Who remembers the Hunter case? Hunter and Southam? Kind of. No, I'm the only one. God, look. Yeah, it's only the older people. So before the charter, I mean, of course an agency could go into any premise and do an inspection. I mean, it's peace, order, and good government. We're the government. Why can't we just go in without consent? There's no problem. And Hunter and Southam suggested that maybe those provisions, well, I don't know. Maybe you should require prior authorization before you go into private property, and maybe you should only be able to go in if there's reasonable grounds knowing that there's an offense. And after Hunter and Southam, for a very short time, there was this thought that, well, are the inspection provisions at risk under Section 8? And the Supreme Court soon after started coming out with a series of decisions saying, well, hold on a second. When it comes to regulatory inspections, no, the privacy interest is not as high. We're going to apply a different standard in determining whether or not a search is reasonable under Section 8. And we're going to see whether or not the provision itself is properly circumscribed. So you had cases like Potash, for instance. And they went on to basically expand this theory. And it's important because it's a provision that appears in almost every, in fact, it's a staple of every regulatory statute. And that is, what is an inspection? It is, of course, the right of a government official to enter private property without a court warrant, without an order, and without consent. And that's the key, is that the agency has lawful authority to be there. But in order to be properly circumscribed when you're drafting that provision, it has to be tied to what is being regulated. This was a problem, for instance, in the Ontario Court of Appeal decision in Johnson from 1990, where under the Tobacco Tax Act, officials were allowed to stop any commercial motor vehicle, and Madam Justice Arbour found that that was too overbroad. There had to be more of a connection to the legislation. So she struck down that inspection provision. And so what you usually see when you're drafting inspection provisions is this nexus. A provincial officer may, without warrant or court order, and without consent, enter a place if the provincial officer, the keywords, reasonably believes that the place contains a thing that is governed by the Act, or an activity is being engaged in that is subject to a requirement for an approval under that Act, and that sort of things. And these are the challenges when drafting these inspection provisions that you have to basically ensure that you put into that particular provision. The second thing that the courts found that was very important with inspections, especially in the Potash decision they noted, is that force can't be used to conduct an inspection. If force is needed to get into a place, then what you see in the statutes usually is that the agency goes and gets an inspection order. Also, during a regulatory inspection, very simple thing, the provincial officer cannot enter a room that's used as a dwelling. If in that place there is a dwelling and it needs to be inspected as part of the inspection, again, you need a judicial inspection order or warrant. The other recourse is when a provincial officer shows up, and if, for instance, the person is refusing that officer to enter the property beyond using an inspection warrant, of course, the officer can basically, in our case, refer to investigations of the enforcement branch, and it may result in obstruction charges. So that was the basic case law. By the early 90s, it was quite settled that regulatory inspection provisions were kosher under Section 8, thankfully. But what started basically happening after that was how inspection powers were being used, which is something that other panels are going to speak about, and that is, can you use your inspection to advance an investigation? If the predominant purpose of the inspector going in is to gather evidence for an investigation, no, that cannot basically be used the inspection power in that way, and that's, of course, the Jarvis and Lean decisions and the case law that came out of that. So, looking at the inspection provisions, I then went on and said, okay, inspections. It seems like every compliance and enforcement regime has two basic questions, which you've already heard about. An agency has to decide which regulated firms to inspect and how to respond when an incident is detected. Less the academics. So let's talk about three types of regulated firms. And Heather sort of alluded to this in her presentation. You have the virtuous firm, the firm that genuinely wants to comply with the law, that puts in place self-auditing functions. They want to do so because of their reputation, because it's good to do, because of ethics. The rational firm, who only understands the bottom line, will only comply because the cost of noncompliance is higher than the cost of compliance. That's the calculation they do, and they're not going to comply unless the threat of the penalty is real. Thinking about that wonderful pyramid again. And then they have someone, or they describe someone called the incapacitated firm, or my assistant director likes to call them the scofflaw firm. And that's because that particular firm will never comply. Either they will never comply because they don't have the capacity to comply, they just do not have the sophistication to comply with whatever regulations are in place, or they refuse to comply. And when the regulator is basically trying to regulate, it's these three types of firms which the literature basically speaks about. Back in the 1980s, there was a debate going on, as you read literature, between those saying the only way that you get high rates of compliance is by strict enforcement. You need to count how many enforcement actions are happening. You have to start seeing that they are going up. And you will see that if enforcement actions go down, there will be low rates of compliance, etc. On the other side were those advocating for a softer approach. They felt persuasion should be the primary tool, and some felt that this was really just a call for deregulation. And so this particular book called Responsive Regulation was basically published in 1992 by Ayers and Braithwaite, and they basically posited this theory called responsive regulation. Has anybody even heard of the regulatory period in responsive regulation? I am glad some people are nodding. So what Braithwaite did was, see, that's why you see pyramids all over the place in enforcement and compliance policies now. They said, well, let's bridge the two. You have to calibrate your enforcement response. And what agencies should do when adopting their particular compliance and enforcement schemes is they should try and represent to the regulated community this particular pyramid. You always start at the base, and you elevate your response, and the most important thing is for the pyramid to be effective, the agency has to show that it is willing to basically take away the firm's ability to basically engage in that business, which is their license. They can either suspend or revoke the license. If the agency doesn't show that capacity, then the pyramid won't work. And when I was reading the literature and I came to this as a lawyer, thinking strict enforcement was actually the better approach. This would be the most effective. But it made me start basically questioning my own sort of assumptions and the importance of basically working from the base. And Heather was talking about nudges, and I have to say, there are a whole bunch of nudges that us lawyers, and that's why it's excellent, your branch, you've probably seen a lot, I know don't know about. I was speaking to some staff because of this presentation, and they were telling me that the latest trend in agencies is a trend called communicating for compliance. What is communicating for compliance? Well, communicating for compliance is actually how you basically reach out to the regulated community and write letters that achieve higher compliance rates. Yep, it's all based on research. You don't just write a letter saying, here are the 5 requirements, comply. If you don't, the maximum penalty is $25 million. Sincerely, provincial officer. You actually, there's a whole science behind it, have to try and induce people to act. So recently, the ministry sent out a lovely letter to the pharmaceutical sector because they have to basically organize a waste disposal program. And there's lovely sentences like this to induce actors to act. Government records show that your business is not complying with Ontario Regulation 29812, setting out rules relating to the collection and management of waste pharmaceuticals. Already, 76% of producers of pharmaceuticals and sharps, like your business, have demonstrated to the ministry that they have taken steps to comply with the regulations. Meaning, we're trying to say to you, business, don't you want to be part of the good guys, not the bad guys? To reduce your chances of an inspection taking place, take the following steps within the next 30 days. Contact the ministry, etc. So again, all these nudges that Heather was talking about are things that take place before the file hits the lawyer's desk, so to speak. And so that's one thing that I know that I have learned a lot, is that by the time the enforcement action gets to our desk, the question is, what happened before? Was there a failure, or was there the appropriate enforcement response? Was it elevated at the appropriate time, or did it take too long to get to the particular enforcement response? And that's the thing about the regulatory pyramid. I think the question we often have to ask is not only elevating the response, but how quickly does the response get elevated, and does it get elevated in a timely fashion? And that is all about follow-up. And follow-up is key. But follow-up takes resources. Probably wondering, when am I starting learning about the provincial scheme? This is the provincial scheme. So the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is divided into these types of regions right here. You have Northern Region, Eastern Region, Southwestern Region, Central Region, and West Central Region. And each of those regions have district offices. You see them listed there. And that allows for the field delivery of all our particular programs. We have 375 inspectors and over 75 investigative positions. That's key about the way that our compliance and enforcement program work. We have a separate investigations and enforcement branch. So you have the abatement staff, who are the ones that use the inspection powers, and when they think a matter is so serious that it should be basically referred to prosecutions, or sorry, it maybe should be a prosecution, they refer the matter over to the investigations and enforcement branch. So we've kept our particular functions separate, and that is helpful for the Jarvis and Ling case law. Let's go back to the two questions. Which regulated firms to inspect? Well, the way that the ministry basically approaches that is it has basically taken its different program areas and it has basically given them or assigned them to each region. So Central Region has hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste, brownfields, property environmental concern, West Central air, and you see the list like this. Those regions are then responsible for basically determining in a given year which facilities are going to be inspected. And as Heather talked about, there are planned inspections and then there are reactive inspections. The planned inspections may be announced or they may be unannounced. The ministry will do a mix of both. Reactive inspections happen because an incident took place. And so following the incident, the ministry then decides this facility now needs to be inspected. we're now going to basically fill out an inspection report. So in a typical year, the ministry basically conducts 3,000 to 4,000 proactive inspections and 350 responsive inspections. And that, of course, is across these types of program areas. So as an example, in 2014 and 15, 4,033 inspections were completed. Here's some more stats. In 2014-15, the ministry completed 1,594 inspections across under the Safe Drinking Water Act for municipal residential drinking water systems, designated facilities, laboratories, non-municipal year-round residential systems, and for compliance with the lead regulations. We also, as you know, do the Drive Clean program. The ministry completed 3,711 vehicle inspections, 501 sector inspection activities, and 601 institutional, commercial, industrial waste inspections. And in 2014 and 15, 7,497 spills were reported, and 7,463 calls from the public were basically responded to at the Spillage Action Center. And that is the key center where the ministry receives complaints, is the Spills Action Center, which will basically result in making a decision at that particular point about whether or not a provincial officer needs to be sent out to that facility upon basically receiving a complaint or the reporting of an incident at the Spills Action Center. In basically choosing which facilities to inspect, each particular region in its program area will go through an integrated planning approach. And in looking at this integrated planning approach, it's very much along the lines of what Heather was talking about. It is about looking in that particular program area which outcomes the particular program area is seeking to achieve, and then which particular facilities require priority. So for example, obviously with respect to air, one of the goals would be to try and ensure that these facilities are not having an adverse effect. So the focus may be on those facilities. We have a regulation called the Air Regulation, Ontario Regulation 419/05, and that in Schedule 4 and Schedule 5 sets out facilities that discharge toxic substances. So those facilities may be the target of a particular inspection program in a particular year. And through each program area, these particular types of priorities will be identified. But the whole entire criteria or lens are developed based on a number of criteria. So it's not just about which priorities, it's also about things like local concerns, and other lenses may come into play, something we call place-based. So I'll give you an example of that. The Clean Water Act, for instance, under that particular act, source protection plans were required to identify the areas where activities were significant threats to municipal wells or municipal intakes. Let's take waste disposal sites. So you can now go to those source protection plans and find out which areas around the well or the intake, those type of activities are significant threats. And by doing so, that begins to inform which facilities should take priority in an inspection program. And that's why you see many of these slides are taken right from the ministry when they basically go out and explain their inspection programs, and they look at it as place-based, sector-based, or pollution source-based. So we were talking about proactive inspections. There's also, as I was speaking about before, responsive inspections that take place. And that's because of calls that basically happen to SAC or some other incident. And the next question that comes up is, when the ministry official goes in and does an inspection, how does the ministry respond? And this is, of course, our compliance policy. So this particular decision tree shows how a ministry official is supposed to go through to analyze his or her response to an incident. When I talk about an incident, I'm not only talking about a violation, I'm talking about an incident that may result in an adverse effect, because the ministry has the ability to issue orders to deal with situations that are not necessarily a violation, but where an adverse effect may occur. Something like a preventive measure orders if they see a particular instance where some work needs to be done in order to basically prevent an adverse effect. What they then go through is I'm going to show you the informed judgment matrix and the case-specific considerations that are in the ministry's compliance policy. And through the application of those two things, they then have to determine which category the particular violation falls in. And from there, they are supposed to document which approach they are taking, because it's supposed to give them guidance on which approach is appropriate. The key things are two types of approaches that Heather was also talking about. The voluntary approach, which means going back to the base of the pyramid that we were looking at, persuasion, warnings, as opposed to a mandatory abatement approach, which means the issuance of orders or referral to investigations and enforcement branch. And this is the heart of the compliance policy, the informed judgment matrix. Along one axis, you have a compliance history of a facility. Along another axis, it's the health and environmental consequence. And for each violation that is found during an inspection, the provincial officer is supposed to determine which category that particular incident falls into. It's interesting because the IGN came up in the early 2000s, and we added the case-specific considerations afterwards, which are right here. So it's not just simply determining whether or not the incident falls into this category. You're supposed to then apply each of these case-specific considerations to see whether or not the actual response should be elevated or de-escalated. So in category 1, you can see it's a voluntary abatement tool is recommended. Category 2 is requiring consideration of a use of mandatory tools. And category 3, for instance, requires referral to the investigations and enforcement branch. And this is the spectrum of tools that the ministry has in basically responding to a violation. And it starts with compliance assistance and outreach, of course, persuasion at the very base of the pyramid, and then going all the way to the referral for investigation and enforcement branch as the ultimate tool to respond to that particular violation. And now, what's that? Oh, to the mic? Oh, I'm sorry. Now we're back to the regulatory pyramid. So in 2005, as I was saying before, the last time I worked on enforcement matters was involving legislation that basically introduced these environmental penalties. And as you can see from the regulatory pyramid here, this was a particular diagram that was put together during that time to explain how the environmental penalties were supposed to address a particular enforcement gap. And what do I mean by a particular enforcement gap? The one thing that I think is missing from the toolkit when it comes to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is the use of something called administrative penalties. And what administrative penalties basically are is just the simple concept of the agency having the authority to monetarily penalize a violator without necessarily having to resort to a court process like a prosecution. And that sort of concept was introduced into ministry legislation back in 1998 under 3 statutes, the Environmental Protection Act, the Pesticides Act, and the Ontario Water Resources Act. And then in 2002, the ministry actually consulted on regulations under those acts, and it listed it was a very broad scheme. It was going to basically cover almost every violation except for the serious violations, like spills or violations of the general pollution prohibition. So these were posted and consulted on in 2002, but there was a big pushback. People were not happy with the administrative penalty proposal. First of all, they felt it unfair because they thought it is unfair for the agency to have this power to penalize without getting the chance to go to court and it being done through a prosecution. There's not a long tradition of having an agency administrative power, administrative penalty power in Ontario, or for that matter at the federal level, except in specific areas like aeronautics or taxation. So it was quite novel. And the other thing that they were concerned about, that stakeholders said, is that it would forever change their relationship with abatement staff. They felt that this would make the relationship far more adversarial. And so they pushed back. That particular program, or that particular proposal, was never finalized. And what's interesting is, in 2005, there was a new government. There were spills taking place in the Sarnia corridor. And there's a great deal of frustration because the only way to respond and to monetarily penalize the particular violators was through prosecutions, which take time and resources. And the government wanted a tool to respond swiftly. And so they said to the ministry, where's our tool to respond swiftly, like in the United States, like Massachusetts? Whenever there's a spill, 30 days, 40 days, whatever, so many days later, there's a penalty. And of course, what they were talking about were administrative penalties. What was the irony was, instead of basically being able to introduce administrative penalties for minor types of violations, the government went on to introduce administrative penalties, and that's what an environmental penalty is, for more serious infractions. And right now, environmental penalties are basically in use for just 9 industrial sectors. So you may say, so? Oh, I have that thing. I'll get that for you, Jack. Not enough, I would probably say. But more needs to be done. And I think when you're talking about administrative penalties, you do have to speak about things like, what is the appropriate level where they should be issued? Can provincial officer frontline staff use them? Or do they have to go to the director level? That's the sort of thing that comes up. But going back to administrative penalties, I want to go back to this. If it's true that we have rational actors and they only understand compliance when the penalty becomes real, then if you're only relying on prosecutions to impose these monetary penalties, think how long that particular circle has to basically go on for before you get resolution. There's no certainty with a fine in knowing what a court is going to set. It has to be. It's by nature of the court. The court's not told how much to basically assign a penalty or a fine for. And the other thing about administrative penalties, when you look, for instance, in the U.S., they can send, or even environmental penalties, very clear signals to the regulated community about what it expects. For instance, in the environmental penalty system, if you have an environmental management system in place, you get a reduction in penalty. In many U.S. jurisdictions, if you basically resolve your contravention within a certain period of time, you get a reduction in penalty. And these are things that are transparent right in the penalty regulation itself. So number one, it gives the agency that ability to basically resolve, especially these contraventions of a minor nature, which are very difficult to pursue through prosecution because of the resources, etc. The ability to deal with these infractions in a much more efficient manner. That's my pitch for administrative penalties, and why I still think, and I think at the federal level they are thinking about introducing them, or they're very close to introducing them hopefully soon. But I do think we have to start addressing the enforcement gap. We have been relying way too much on prosecutions to deal with a whole bunch of matters that should be dealt with through the agency level. What do you want prosecutions for? Prosecutions, remember, are supposed to be with the highest stigma. You get a conviction. And when you look in the U.S., the prosecutions are going against individuals who are falsifying records. It is these big cases where there is wrongdoing, not because a company extended a particular, let's say, sewage works without an approval, which, of course, let's say they may have been able to get some days down, et cetera, and that stuff. What types of matters should be subject to prosecutions? And this is what, to me, the administrative penalty sort of power allows you to do. It starts rationalizing your prosecutorial resources a lot more effectively. One other thing I think that we should be looking at. Let's talk about the cost of regulation. And what I mean by that is how much it costs to go out and inspect these facilities and do follow-up, etc. Some independent agencies of government, like the TSSA, for instance, and many municipalities have introduced inspection fees. Is that a bad thing? I'm sure companies don't want it, but the thing that inspection fees basically signal is, number one, there will be money going back to, if it's put into a dedicated fund, to the agency for their particular compliance and enforcement program. And then it basically tells the regulated firm that if the provincial officer has to keep on coming back, well, it's going to cost that much more. And so I think it is worth thinking about the Drummond report at the provincial level, which called for making sure that there's more cost recovery, looking at cost recovery as part of the inspection and compliance program. So I go back to, in this particular case, it's a more nuanced three-firm sort of approach that one of my clients had as a slide as part of their communicating compliance. The whole entire goal of these compliance and enforcement programs is to make the firms virtuous. And that's the question, how do you do that? Because the regulator can't be there all the time looking to see what a particular firm is doing. The critical point is not only sending out the deterrence message, which is key, but inducing firms to make sure that they remain virtuous. And sometimes a really aggressive enforcement approach, and this was an insight that I did not have before doing all the literature reading, can actually be counterproductive. There's a study I cite in my paper under the Clean Air Act where it was identified that it was actually close monitoring of the actual facilities that led to higher rates of self-auditing as opposed to strict enforcement approaches and the threat of punishment. That has to be done in the appropriate case. But as going back to Braithwaite, like he says, it's important to always operate from the base of the pyramid, starting with persuasion first, particularly with the firms who are already trying to be virtuous. Anyhow, my time, I'm sure, is about up. Thank you.
Great questions. I couldn't help but thinking, as you were talking about the virtuous firm, and an earlier question in the other session, which was referred to social media in a different context. But has there been any thought given to or maybe you do it? These days, social media are very influential in corporate behavior. There is a possibility of naming and shaming, I guess, that sort of thing. Are those sorts of tools part of this communications for compliance, or is it just a one-on-one thing where the government sends out these letters urging people to behave a little better?
Right now, the Communicating for Compliance is a very one-on-one letter. And it's interesting what you speak about, because I find the Americans do have a lot of programs where they try and basically highlight a firm's performance in a very positive way. And for instance, they will start a program that I've seen where they'll say, you can basically become part of this program and use our logo on your site. as being, great if you basically do X, Y, and Z and agree, and then a company can say, we're a great performer under the US EPA or something like this. The ministry had a similar thing, and I have to say when it was introduced in 2004, 2005, as a lawyer, I was like, what is this? But I understand it better now, thanks to this literature, and it was called the Environmental Leaders Program. And the Environmental Leaders Program is literally something that you would basically show that you had an environmental management system in place. You would do attestations, et cetera, about compliance. Then the ministry would basically pause and say, okay, this particular company has joined the Environmental Leaders Program, and they would get certain benefits, things like they were assured certain turnaround times on approvals decisions, a meeting with the minister, things like this. But they tried to create this sort of basket of benefits. But you're right, it's trying to use the carrots. And that is a critical thing that you have to try and come up with, not just the stick.
Okay, here's a question. Is there any kind of exigent circumstances exception to the warrant requirement? For example, danger of destruction of evidence, or if the perpetrators may flee the jurisdiction before a warrant can be obtained?
Yeah, you're allowed to do a search. It's actually in the Environmental Protection Act, that if there are exigent circumstances, then the search may be conducted. So I think it's Section 162 or something like this, but you can look and see that there is provision in that. In exigent circumstances, you can basically not have to get a warrant. So it's an interesting question, that stuff. I don't think that section has ever been challenged constitutionally. I'm not trying to think about in the case law what it does. Or has anybody ever said, that doesn't meet the Hunter test. How can you go and do that? So remember, when we're talking about that exigent circumstances, it can't be an inspection because, remember again, you can do an inspection of any place as long as you have the nexus. What the person seems to be asking is, can I not have to get a search warrant in exigent? And the answer is yes. There are, the MOECC statutes provide for that in things like, I think it's Section 162 in the EPA.
Another one, can prosecutors, as a condition of plea or conviction after trial, require a corporation to provide community service activities, or, for example, taking out newspaper or trade journal ad apologizing for violations and describing plans for future compliance?
Well, I guess it's almost creative sentencing, it almost sounds like. And I'm looking over at Paul and Fred, and I think, I think Paul, I can leave that to Paul and Fred to answer. There may be some leeway for that, but it's more under the Provincial Offences Act.
Okay.
And the
both of them will be speaking, so
they will be. So let me defer.
We might reserve that. Okay.
On that.
This actually, the next question is sort of touches on the one I guess that I asked. Does the ministry publicly ID, or identify, and congratulate particular corporations for innovative compliance programs and technologies? Which is similar to this sort of social
it's similar
media
to the sort of thing, except for the Environmental Leaders Program. I'm not aware to what extent they do so, publicly. And I think it's something, obviously, with respect to an area and that stuff, that any agency should look at, because again, it may be something to lead this firm to be more virtuous in that.
It's sort of analogous to what's been done with green labeling in a way, I suppose.
Well, that's exactly it. I think what comes up there, of course, is just basically coming up with the brand and getting people to basically buy into that particular brand.
A question on administrative penalty. Does administrative penalty procedure include any opportunity for the penalized violator to contest or object to the nature of the violation or the amount of the penalty in an administrative hearing?
Absolutely. So that's a very critical question. The reason I was sort of surprised in the early 2000s when folks were very upset about the administrative penalty is right in the legislation it said you, of course, can appeal that decision to the Environmental Review Tribunal. And that's the key thing about agencies. I mean, when people were saying you should have to go to court, they were being a very dicey and sort of view of law, right? My God, the agency just executes. They shouldn't be the one basically deciding if you're guilty or innocent. You should have to go to a separate forum for that. But the agency has the executive, administrative, legislative, it has a policy-making functions all under one roof. I mean, we've learned that in the 1930s and 1940s. And I think the key thing is That's what procedure is so important when drafting administrative penalty provisions. You have to make decisions like, is there going to be some sort of opportunity to contest it? Yes. Okay. Is it a quasi-judicial hearing that is going to be required? And in MOEC statutes, the answer is yes, you get to go to the tribunal. But different administrative penalty provisions have different procedures in place. And I have to say there's a lot broader multitude than was back in 2002. And that's why I'm saying I think it's time for us to catch up with respect to the use of those sort of penalties.
Here's another question about administrative penalties. Would you please comment on how administrative penalties could be used in regulating greenhouse gas emissions in conjunction with the proposed cap and trade legislation in Ontario?
Well, there is administrative penalties, first of all, as you probably know, authority in the new legislation that's being proposed. And if you go to California, I'm sure you'll probably find an AM scheme. And the answer would be, of course, there's two things that administrative penalty component usually has. A gravity component for the seriousness of the violation, and then an economic benefit component. And you literally have a formula, for instance, in the environmental penalty regulation, that basically allows you to calculate, if you haven't, let's say, installed a piece of equipment and it's 6 months late, how much money did you benefit by basically waiting 6 months to install that piece of equipment? So the answer for those types of schemes, let's say for 419 or whatever, do you want to go to court and have to prosecute a particular case involving something like as complex as emission trading? I mean, it's going to be quite interesting explaining that to the justice. So I think that those types of schemes, Ontario Regulation 419 or whatever, that are particularly complicated, sophisticated, administrative penalties are particularly in penalizing the corporation. I'm not talking about the individual, but the corporation are very ideal. And the answer is, yeah, I think in those types of schemes, absolutely in those types of trading schemes, penalties play an important role.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank not only Jamie, but all the presenters this morning. Obviously, Heather, John, Martin, who I hope is watching. And I think this has provided us a really good overview and context for moving into the more detailed examination of the compliance regime, which we will continue with for the rest of the day. Right now, I will invite the audience here to take coffee. Those of you on the web will have to fire up your own espresso machines, and we will return at 11:15. Thank you very much.